So I want to talk about virtual reality and 3D printing, not as a gimmick, but as something that we're using for material science research, and how we're connecting a lot of the experiments we're doing to the simulations by having this new way of viewing it. I just want to mention all the people involved in the funding, just right off the bat. Associate Professor Nigel Marks and myself are co-leading the Curtin Carbon Group. Some of this work is also was done by Dr. Irene Suarez-Martinez. And this is the great group of students that we have currently. We also have a Forest Creative Fellow who I'll introduce a bit later. And part of what we do is that interdisciplinary research between chemistry, physics, and engineering. And our focus at the moment is how can we rethink carbon, not as a pollutant in the atmosphere, but as a material that is actually critical for all of the green technology that we need to decarbonize. So inside of every lithium-ion battery, there is about a quarter graphite, and it's actually critical for the battery operation. It's where the lithium goes when you charge your battery. Activated carbons are used for supercapacitors, and we're also exploring them for hydrogen storage. Fuel cells contain either graphite or a glassy carbon electrode, and these are very inert, and they're very important for the fuel cell. And I was surprised to learn there's actually more carbon or more graphite in a hydrogen fuel cell car than in a lithium-ion battery car. We're also working on carbon black, how carbon forms in the gas phase. That's what most of my research up to date has been about. I won't talk so much about that today. And we've also done some industry projects where we've been coating different steel, including pipelines, with a diamond-like coating to stop hydrogen getting in and destroying the steel. And today I want to just talk quickly about 3 ways in which visualization has opened up sort of new insights into tough problems in material science. And just off the bat, I want to mention Dr. Andrea Rassell, who is a creative fellow. She's actually a nano filmmaker, and she's been very instrumental in helping us use the technology and see it more than just as a gimmick. And also Callum and Carl, who helped with, who are students who helped with this. And a lot of this work was done with the Hive, which is the hub for immersive visualization and e-research. So just starting off, one of the topics that we're very interested in is what's the nanostructure of disordered carbon? So putting this along the scale, you've got the crystalline forms of carbon, diamond and graphite. And then you've got the amorphous forms of carbon, which have no long-range or short-range order. But the disordered carbons lie in between those two. They have some short-range order, but they don't have any long-range order. And these are very tough to understand. These have been a persistent problem in carbon science for the last sort of 50, 60 years. And why are they so interesting? Well, they're really the industrial workhorse of the carbon material world. So in terms of the higher density materials, these hard carbons, they can be used as crucibles, heat shields. They're used in sodium-ion batteries, fuel cells, and also as electrodes in electrochemistry. If you oxidize those materials, you produce a lower density material with a lot of porosity. And these are activated or nanoporous carbons, and they're used for water purification and then capture of gases and hydrogen storage. Here's a hydrogen fuel cell car, and the idea here is that you would cool down the activated carbon to liquid nitrogen temperatures and allow the hydrogen to be stored at a lower pressure. And before I arrived in the group, Associate Professor Nigel Marks had spent a lot of time trying to develop incredibly accurate models of these carbons using molecular dynamic simulations. So here is a simulation showing an amorphous carbon that's annealed. And what you see is the self-assembly of a highly structured, complex network of graphene sheets in 3 dimensions. And after a lot of benchmarking and about 10 years of work, these models represent a highly accurate description of disordered carbons. They're able to capture all of the major features, both in the XRD and also the electron microscopy, all of the textures. And most recently, we've been finding them to be incredibly accurate for describing porous carbons. So this is one of the models developed here. This is 1 gram per cc. And this was actually done by another group, Alex Nymark's group here. This is the experimental data for gas absorption on norit, which is a type of activated carbon. And you can see here the simulated absorption curves for the quadrupolar gases, and also for the these different hydrocarbons. And at least for the non-polar species, it seems that just the carbon network itself is enough to describe some fairly complex gas isotherms. And that was done using grand canonical Monte Carlo, which I can go into if you want more detail. But the challenge really is that even though we've got the position of every atom within this, and it seems to match all the experiments, embarrassingly, we really struggle to understand these structures. So, you know, we struggle to understand how the atoms were all connected because it was such a complex structure. I mean, we were definitely a step closer because we produced a model that that at least closely analogued the physical system, but it was still too complicated a structure to understand. So we need to tease that apart, and that's where I started to look into some advanced visualization. And the first step for us was, well, I wonder if I can 3D print this. And now I had experienced 3D printing previously because I'd been doing some work on biotechnology where we've been 3D printing nasal cavities, trying to look at how nasal sprays go into the nasal cavity. So I'd had some experience. And one thing I knew is that you need a triangular mesh. And so in order to achieve the triangular mesh, I transformed the graphene network into a triangular mesh by placing a vertex at the center of each ring. So there's a ring algorithm that finds all of the shortest paths, which is the rings, and then you place a vertex in the center of that, connect them all up, and you get a triangular mesh. Now, the triangular mesh is very easily manipulated in a lot of software, a lot of CAD software. And so I was able to put that into MeshLab, thicken that single surface into a volume, which could be printed. And so these here are some of the first 3D prints we did maybe about 4 years ago. And you can see here that at different densities, you can get a really good feel for the microporosity. I should also mention at this stage that these models are periodic simulations. So there is actually no edges. You're actually seeing an edge that is connected across the periodic boundary. So that also makes these models very hard to analyze. The other thing we could do is this mesh was able to be analyzed in a different way from just the carbon atoms. So, for example, we could color the different rings by whether they are 6-membered, 5-membered, or 7-membered, and we were able to find grain boundaries. And we were also able to find isolated non-hexagonal rings that actually allow the structure to curve in 3-dimensional space. The other thing is you can do curvature analysis of this mesh because it is actually a discrete mesh. You can't actually do that on the graphene network. And you can compute the curvature, a metric of the curvature. So, for example, if it's saddle shape, it's red in this case, and if it's bowl shaped, it's blue. And by doing this curvature analysis, we could analyze many different many of these self-assembled structures. And we found that they all contained a net saddle shape or a net negative Gaussian curvature. And this is actually, this was quite a hard problem to solve. We'd previously tried just to count the number of non-hexagonal rings, but actually this is a real edge here. And you can see that there's a whole bunch of non-hexagonal rings that are clustering at the edge. So they don't contribute to the curvature at all. So actually counting the number of hexagonal rings was a red herring, and doing this curvature analysis on a mesh proved to be much more successful. And so this allowed us to kind of put together a comprehensive model for disordered carbons, all the way from the glassy carbons, the non-porous carbons, which are these here, through to the porous carbons. And we found that they had this saddle-like shape, which is that foam topology. So it's actually a disordered 3D graphene is the way that we're describing it. But we also found a whole bunch of very interesting defective structures. And the one that I just want to highlight is we found screw dislocations. So these here are spiral defects through the structure, and they're particularly prominent in the highest density structures. And this solved a big problem for us, which is how do you get things that are stacked, but also continuously connected in three-dimensional space? And I wanted to go looking for these screw defects because I also very much enjoy the electron microscope. So I started to look in the disordered carbons, and it became clear that that wasn't going to work. At the same time, I was speaking to Dr. Jason Fogg, who was a PhD student at the time, and he was looking at how graphite forms. And in particular, graphite's important for batteries, and he'd been developing this lovely little furnace here that is able to heat up to 3,000 degrees in a couple of seconds. So this is actually the graphite furnace inside of an atomic absorption spectrometer. But we were using it for material science research. And because this heats up so quickly, we're able to heat up the material, start the graphite formation process, and then kind of quench it out, and then look at the sample. So we're able to pulse this many, many times. And so we took that to one of the new instruments in Western Australia, which is a very nice electron microscope. And we're able to look at graphite forming. And you can see here, this is after a single pulse, and then after 6 pulses, you can start to see these dots here are actually single carbon atoms. So, I mean, graphite's easy to image in the TEM, so it's not the most remarkable thing, but they're quite nice images of graphite. And then when it came to quite a few pulses, we found some interlayer defects that were very consistent with a screw dislocation. And these hadn't been imaged before, particularly this ramp between the layers. And we're pretty sure that those are screw dislocations. Now we kind of came to the point of thinking, how do these actually form? And what role do the screws play? And again, we turn to computer simulations. So this here is the initial setup. We've got these graphene flakes all aligned. This actually mimics the mesophase, which is how all graphitizing materials, they all have to go through a liquid crystal phase where the molecules align. And then they cross-link. And here's the simulation going here. And again, we do see the layers forming, but really it's pretty impossible to, just from looking at this on the screen, to understand what's going on. And I was talking to my colleague, and he just didn't think there were any screws in this. And it was very hard to actually visualize it in 2 dimensions. And so what we did is we called up the Hive, which is Curtin University's visualization studio, which has this beautiful 180-degree cylinder display, full 3D, with stereoscopic glasses. And the whole group came down. And the first thing that we did is we looked at some idealized screws so that we understood what they look like. And then we put in our models, and we were able to see these screws. Now, it's a bit hard for me to show you that in this visualization. The next one that was a bit easier is using virtual reality. So Dr. Andrea Rassell, who's the creative fellow I mentioned earlier, she suggested that we use the Oculus Rift, and there's actually a software called Nanome that allows you to pick up the models in 3D and to manipulate them. Now, this is actually designed for biomolecules, but if you convert all the carbon atoms to hydrogen, it seems to allow you to insert it. So this was my first attempt, and this made it very easy to see that there are certainly screws going through this. You can take yourself down one of those screws, and there's lots of screws, and the way they connect is quite interesting and complex. And we also 3D printed those models. And through 3D printing, we were actually able to look at the different mechanisms as well of how the screw is removed. If you want to go into the gory details, it's quite fun. It involves screw and edge dislocations and edge glides and pair annihilation. It's very fun for me. But the thing that we also discovered, which was quite fun, was the kinetics of graphitization. So we found that graphite forms within 10 seconds at 3,000 degrees. And I've since had many chats with graphite companies that make graphite on the ton scale, and their kind of thought before we did this work was that graphite forms on the minute to hour time scale. So we've actually been working with quite a few companies to reduce their power bill and hopefully their CO2 emissions as well. And I just wanted to mention we've been running a workshop we ran a workshop in July on graphite, and we had 50 different industry leaders come and talk about it. Graphite seems to be on the up at the moment. The last story I wanted to tell in the last 5 minutes was what Callum Wood did with this visualization. So he was standing here, and the thing he did is he dipped his head because he wanted to see underneath one of these layers. And the reason he did this is he loves VR gaming. And in VR gaming, your head is tracked. And so you can actually be immersed in the sense that your head is tracked, you move down and you change the view. And he was quite disappointed with the Hive that he was unable to do this. And so what I said to him is, do you want to make a virtual reality game that allows you to go inside of these models? And the reason I wanted to do this is we now have some enormous models. So this is 1 million carbon atoms that is very hard to visualize. Actually, the computer struggles to render the whole thing. And I said, maybe you could have a go with that. And so he developed in Unity this procedurally generated visualization that is actually able to load some of the largest models that we've made. And this was done in collaboration with Dr. Andrea Rassell, who actually produced it into a visualization that is now looks great. That'd be my recommendation with visualization. Don't try to do it yourself. This here is actually looking inside a porous carbon. And we're actually using a lot of these models now to understand how hydrogen is stored within the pores of these disordered carbons. You can see here, this is actually a little bit of sp3 type carbon here where they interact. And this has been really helpful to actually analyze and understand models that are too big for us to traditionally understand. We've got a whole bunch of tools where we can take pictures and export XYZ coordinates so that we can analyze them on the computer after we've gone through and had a look through it. And Andrea also submitted this to the Science Gallery Bengaluru, and there's currently 2 VR headsets set up in a science gallery there, all about carbon and understanding what carbon means for the future of the planet. And so people are actually going to be able to go inside of batteries, for example, and understand carbon's role not only as the problem, but also as part of the solution. The last thing I've got a few seconds to work through is a student, Callum, who basically has a beautiful 3D printer at home and has been trying to give us some very high resolution models. So here is his 3D printer, and it's I call it a goo 3D printer because it's got a whole bunch of polymer here, and it gets photopolymerized. And you can see here this beautiful bond resolution model here. And I can talk through how we did this. But what he did is he actually took pictures at different time steps through the simulation and was able to generate these sort of stop motion pictures here. So yeah, I can talk more about that if anyone's interested, but I just wanted to mention that for us, visualization, I thought that it was a gimmick and not very useful, but it actually, when it comes to very complicated computational models, it becomes a critical tool for understanding how it works, and those insights have allowed us to do experiments that have really revealed some new things about carbon materials. So thank you for your time.
Very much, Jacob. That was incredible and fascinating. You're right. I think a lot of us have thought these tools were gimmicks or just for fun. But Looked very helpful. Does anybody in the chat have any questions? We've got a few minutes. No. Can people confirm they can hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, cool. Well, I might ask a question then. So, I mean, those simulations are incredible. And like the fact that they're getting like those gas absorption curves correct suggests that they're probably right. And these spirals forming as well. I mean, are these all full QM, or is it QM inside these simulations? Or, I mean, how is it getting it so right?
Yeah, so I think it's partially because Nigel Marks has spent 15 years benchmarking every force field for carbon.
Right.
And so this is, a decade worth of work in terms of trying to make sure that all of the interactions are described correctly. One of the things that I think was unique about his approach was that he was actually interested in amorphous carbon. So he was interested in this amorphous carbon here. And so most of his work was on trying to make sure he got graphite right and amorphous carbon. And by doing that, most other force fields were focused on one or the other, like diamond or graphite. But because he fitted a lot of the transition states as well, which a lot of the force fields don't do, the disordered sits between those two extremes. So he was able to capture both of those. So I think that was part of the importance, and also just benchmarking everything very, very carefully. So most of these models are, until they're compared to experiment, they're almost useless, I think. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So it's all force fields.
Force fields fitted against ab initio MD.
Okay. Right. Cool. But, yeah. I mean, the fact that you had your hybridization changing and that you were unwrapping between layers, I thought it must be some quantum in there at least.
Well, there is early on, but I will admit that we now are working on machine learning force fields for carbon. And what's very nice for Nigel, at least, is that all of the machine learning potentials are spitting out the same structures as his empirical force field. So it's further evidence that he did get it right. And there's some things he didn't quite get right, like the interlayer spacing, but that's all getting sorted out by these nice machine learning approaches.
Let's not let them take our jobs, yeah.
So
how long does it take to do a million carbon atom simulation at this level?
Yeah, 2 weeks on the Pawsey supercomputer.
That's not too bad at all. I mean,
no, it's not too bad.
Tim, you had a question?
Yeah, great stuff. Thanks, Jacob. I was wondering, the visualization is really cool, but can you mathematically define something like a curvature on your surface? So some kind of vector field that you can get at any point on your surface, and then you can just mathematically find these screw defects, right? Rather than have to look for them by eye, or is there some reason that's not doable or just too hard?
Oh yeah, I mean, actually, I've got a PhD student, Gabriel Francis, who is now using all of these curvature metrics to pull out the dislocations, and we're actually able to do this all automated.
Cool.
One of the and do it quantitatively. And I think for me, what's always important is being able to understand what's in the structures. Because until you understand, for example, that there are these grain boundaries, it's very hard to think of an algorithm to extract certain things. So, everything's clear in hindsight. So what we're trying to do is provide that initial exploratory work that allows us to say, well, there are screw defects. So what is a way we could extract those and quantify them? So that for us is our workflow, because I think it helps us in the preliminary stages of these computational studies to give us some insights on what we should actually be measuring. Because the other option is you just measure everything, all the different quantitative metrics, but you're not really sure what each of them pulls out. So I suppose that's been our approach.